Good morning, everyone. Well, at least it's still morning in Wyoming. I know some of you are in different time zones, but we're so glad to have you all with us today for the last in our 6-part NARUC-WEEB Carbon Capture Utilization and Storage Workshop webinar series. I want to thank again NARUC and WEEB for their support, obviously DOE support of our subcommittee to allow these webinars to occur. I think they've been an outstanding series of information of various portions of the carbon capture world. As you know, they are recorded, so you can go back and listen to any that you have missed. Today, we're going to talk about regulatory considerations and policy recommendations, and I'm thrilled that Doug Scott from Great Plains Institute agreed to join me today to wrap up the webinar series. We're going to do a kind of a back and forth today, a little bit different. I'm going to start out with a few slides, and then we'll go to Doug and then back to me. So, Kira, if you could perhaps start my first slide deck, please. Next slide. So today I'm going to start with what carbon capture leadership has looked like in Wyoming for many years, and then talk about my view of what's impeding utilities from pursuing carbon capture technology. And I spend a lot of my time outside my duties as chairman of the Wyoming Public Service Commission talking about regulatory innovation as it relates to carbon capture and posing the question of whether that's been a missing piece to get buy-in from utilities on carbon capture projects. Then I'm going to hand it back over to Doug, and he's going to talk about Great Plains Institute's carbon capture efforts and talk about this concept of being carbon capture ready, what policies and incentives your state need to have to be carbon capture ready. And then Doug will hand it back to me, and I'll finish up the webinar today by talking about an example of regulatory innovation in Wyoming, recent legislation that was passed that we refer to as House Bill 200. And then we hope that there'll be sufficient time to ask some questions. We intentionally designed these webinars with a limited number of speakers so that we can allow for questions of our listeners. So thank you for being with us today. Next slide. So Wyoming has long been a leader in carbon capture, and Wyoming's really looked at this from a variety of fronts, and this started actually even before the Meade administration, but Governor Meade really took up the mantle of carbon capture. Governor Gordon is certainly continuing that in his administration, but I want to walk through what carbon capture leadership has looked like in Wyoming over the past few years, from the legal framework perspective, from technology and research, and then on CO2 pipeline corridors. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go through these different statutes, but I think it's important to understand, and I think Doug will talk about this a little bit, that it's important that your state have the legal framework necessary to integrate carbon capture projects into your state. And here are just some examples of various topics that the Wyoming legislature has addressed in the recent past on pore space, for example, or permitting issues, certification for the CO2 that is stored. So this has really provided a basic legal framework from a statutory perspective to accommodate carbon capture. Next slide. In addition, Senator Barrasso from Wyoming has been a national leader on federal policy related to carbon capture. We've talked a lot in this webinar series about 45Q tax credits. It was part of the Futures Act, and he's also pursuing the Use It Act to further the promotion of carbon capture. Next slide. On the technology front, Wyoming has also been a leader both through the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources, and you were able to hear from a couple of those people in past webinars in this series to talk about those efforts. On the storage front, Wyoming has been successful in securing a carbon-safe Phase 2 project that's sponsored by the DOE, and significantly in just the last couple of weeks, Wyoming has been given Class 6 primacy over these injection wells, which has been an important step as well. The School of Energy Resources also is doing rare earth elements research and beneficiation research. We also benefit from the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute that's located in Casper. They do a great deal of work on carbon capture. And then through the Wyoming Energy Authority and the Governor's Office, we also have the Integrated Test Center, which is testing the utilization piece of carbon capture technology. And you heard from Jason Beggar, the Deputy Director, I think in webinar 2 about the different projects that are going on there between XPRIZE, which is looking at various technologies like methanol, biocomposite foam, plastics, concrete materials, etc. There are other entities testing there, such as Japan Coal Energy Center, and they are testing their solid sorbent capture technology. So we have a lot of research efforts going on in Wyoming, as we've discussed in the webinar series, both on the utilization and the storage front. Next slide, please. Wyoming has also been a leader on CO2 pipeline corridors. This is a map that shows existing pipeline corridors in Wyoming, and you can see the proximity to both emitting resources, which are the circles, and the triangles, which are potential EOR targets. So you can see that we have a great deal of infrastructure already in place, but Wyoming has worked with Great Plains on streamlining the permitting process for these corridors, given the need for the infrastructure that will need to go forward. Next slide, please. But even with all of these leadership areas in Wyoming and strong support from the recent administrations, we still do not have a carbon capture project proposed in Wyoming on a coal plant, which is the focus of a lot of legislative efforts and administrative efforts as well. And so, as I mentioned, I spend quite a bit of my time outside of my regular duties thinking about this and talking about this on a regional and national level, and really wondering what's impeding utilities from pursuing carbon capture technology on their plants. And I've come up with a couple of things that I like to talk about to help people understand what the differences are and why we may have this hesitation. One is the utility risk profile compared to a business model of someone they might be partnering with for an EOR project, for example, and also just the financial incentives that utilities have historically. Next slide. So this slide demonstrates beta as industry, by industry as of January 2019. Beta is a measure of the stock's volatility in relation to the market and is often used as a proxy for risk. By definition, the market has a beta of 1, and individual stocks are ranked according to how much they deviate from the market. A low beta indicates low volatility and low risk tolerance. You'll notice on the far right bar that the utility industry has the lowest beta of the industry groups depicted here. And you wonder why the utility risk is so much lower. It's largely because of the regulatory component of their investment strategies. Those investments have to be approved by a commission for cost recovery. And so they have an extra layer of regulation in place to make sure that they are making non-risky investments, because those are paid for by ratepayers. In contrast, you'll notice about midway in that chart, the beta for oil and gas P&E companies is one of the highest on the charts. And I think we can all understand that those companies do take on a great deal of risk. They win big and sometimes they lose big. But I think with carbon capture most usually being used for enhanced oil recovery at this point, even having a conversation about these projects between two companies, two types of entities with very different risk profiles and very different business models, sometimes make even just communicating about these projects and the willingness to talk about them somewhat difficult. Next slide, please. And I touched on this briefly, but utilities make money through the traditional rate-making model. And I always say, hate the game, not the player. This is the way that their business model works. This is how they are financially incentivized to do it. They want to put investment into rate base. And to date, I think because of the lack of commercial success, carbon capture projects don't get a green light from regulators, or utilities are even concerned about bringing it up to their regulators about whether their carbon capture investment could go into rate base. They have big price tags. And again, because of lack of commercial success to date, commissions and the regulatory bodies are reluctant to put those into rate base at this point. And so we have to, I think outside the box a little bit and find different ways for utilities to make money outside of traditional rate making until the time that carbon capture is more commercially viable. And then the carrot for the utility will be the ability to get a large price tag item into rate base for these projects going forward. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to leave you with this and hand it off to Doug, but this is the question I pose all the time. Given what we've learned in this webinar series and over time about the legal innovation, addressing the framework issues, the technology innovation, is it really the regulatory piece that we're missing in terms of innovation to actually promote these projects going forward? All right, so I'm going to hand it over to my co-panelist. I'm, as I said, just thrilled that Doug would agree to join me on this today. He's the Vice President for Electricity and Efficiency at the Great Plains Institute. In that role, Doug works on issues involving the changing utility business model, climate strategy and regulatory response, and carbon capture, sequestration, and usage. Before joining GPI in February 2015, Doug served as the chairman of the Illinois Commerce Commission, and prior to that as the director of the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency. Doug's public service also includes a term as mayor of Rockford, Illinois, 3 terms as an Illinois state representative, and 10 years as an attorney for the City of Rockford Legal Department. Doug earned his BA with honors from the University of Tulsa and a JD with honors from Marquette. It's all yours, Doug.
Well, thanks very much, Chair Fornstrom, and I want to thank NARUC and the Western Interstate Energy Board for inviting me to be part of this. It's been a great series of webinars I've enjoyed watching, and so I'm really honored to be with you today. Chair, that was an excellent lead-in, and I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the state roles in CCUS policy, and I'll be maybe a little bit more general, talking about kind of the menu of options that are available for states. And I know that the chair then will come back and follow up and be a little bit more specific about her state and some of the things that you're doing there. Next slide, please. I'm going to go through a few very quickly here. One is just on Great Plains Institute. We've been working for nearly 2 decades on carbon capture issues, and in a lot of ways I'll talk about in a moment, including launching the Carbon Capture Coalition back in 2011. I was actually part of it then when I was a state official in Illinois, and we had a lot of work going on at that particular point with the Future Gen project, for those of you who remember that, as well as other projects in the state where folks were actively looking at carbon capture. And then we've had a massive pilot by and through ADM in our state for a long time. So we've had the benefit of learning a lot about carbon capture that way as well. And the state work group there in 2015 started working on that immediately upon getting to GPI and putting together groups of states to talk about these issues in a way where they could really work for the benefit of all the states involved. Next slide, please. So there's really 3 basic pieces that GPI works on, and actually we facilitate all of these different projects. The Carbon Capture Coalition is a national organization really working on trying to make changes to the federal law, some of which the chair mentioned in her earlier slide deck. State Carbon Capture Work Group, I'll talk about that a little bit more specifically in a moment, which is a group of states working together on these issues. And more recently, the Regional Carbon Capture Deployment Initiative, which is really geared toward taking all that we've learned and all we know with folks who are very interested in this issue and trying to see if we can actually move projects forward. Next slide, please. And I know you heard all about this in earlier segments, so I'm going to go through this really quickly, but obviously to try to make these projects work, it's not just something states can do. It's really not just something the federal government can do. There really are specific and really important roles for both the federal government and the state government, as well as regional collaboration. So the ability to actually move things forward really takes a lot of cooperation and a lot of action from a lot of players. Next slide, please. So the State Carbon Capture Work Group, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, was really formed by Kara's governor at that time, Governor Meade, and Governor Bullock from Montana. The idea at the time when we were starting to put it together was that we thought we would get about a half a dozen states together to work on these policies. We're at 4 times that many states now, as you can see from the map. And that group has done 4 comprehensive studies, one looking at carbon capture finance just in general, one focusing on the pipelines, the economics toward building pipelines, one looking at markets. If you get a facility built and you have carbon for the market, can that facility, whether it's a coal plant or a gas plant, can they still bid that power into the market? Will it actually work from an economic standpoint? And then one on the ethanol industry and their impact on carbon capture efforts, very substantial industry in this effort. So again, this group has been very prolific. State officials have worked very hard in identifying issues and putting together some really good working documents there. Next slide, please. The regional deployment initiatives then, as I said earlier, are really formed around this idea that, okay, now that we know this information, how do we use it to try to move projects forward? Trying to match carbon sources with potential sinks is one way of doing that. And that's really what RDI does. The two main areas, as you can see there, are in the Midwest and then in the West. And we're a little loose with our geography of what we call Midwest and West, but you can see from the map the two groups. And then because Oklahoma and Texas are really essential to, especially from a storage standpoint, they end up being part of both groups. Next slide, please. So part of what the RDI has done is trying to figure out what is economically feasible capture retrofit with 45Q. And again, we used modeling that brought together a number of entities from Stanford, Los Alamos, NETL, the IEA, United States Geological Services, and many others, including GPI. And again, this is not just totally on power plants. We tend to think of carbon capture as a coal or maybe a gas plant play, but it's huge in terms of industrial uses, as you can see from the chart there on the left-hand side of the slide. And being on here does not mean that there is interest in some kind of a retrofit. It just means that because of its size, its age, the other equipment that's there at the site, that it's a candidate for being able to do that, just so we could get an idea of how much potential CO2 is out there that could be captured. Next slide, please. And then utilizing the work from Stanford and NETL, IEA, and the National Petroleum Council put together this chart just so we can, you have some basis. And again, I know you'll get all of these slides to study it more carefully. But to go back to the last slide, what economically feasible means, that's what this chart is designed to help show us. Next slide, please. And then taking that data and then matching it up with the potential sinks for carbon. And so what this slide does is take all of that information and saying in an optimized near-term network for carbon that's been captured, what would we need to do to try to move that around to be able to get it to the places where it would be utilized and or stored. And then the next slide is just, is just a long term. It's the same idea, but then looking long term at what are the possibilities for carbon capture and storage and usage. And as you can see, I mean, there's a lot of activity that's potentially possible there. So if we go to the next slide, here's where I'm going to spend the bulk of my time. And this concept that Chair Fornstrom mentioned about being carbon capture ready. Be able to take advantage of the federal tax credit, the 45Q tax credit before its expiration, although there is a lot of work trying to see if they can get it extended in Washington. But the idea here is to recognize that every state is different. So I'm not presenting this to you as a one size fits all and here's the 10 things that you have to do. But what I am doing is suggesting that these are things that you could think about from individual states and see if it makes sense for you. Obviously, some of these things, Wyoming's a great example, have already done a lot of these things. Other states are looking at that. The politics, the finances are all different in every state. So the idea here is just to try to give you some examples of what could be done to try to be ready if these carbon capture projects present themselves to you in your particular states. Are things on here like, taking a look at severance taxes and things like that. Obviously, the economics of every state is really different today than it was 8 months ago because of COVID. And so again, recognizing that, we're not suggesting this is the checklist everybody has to go through, but these are things that you should at least think about. I think the other important part on this one, I'm not going to read all these points to you, but thinking about in terms of establishing a state policy or a regulatory regime, think about who's responsible for what, how is it coordinated within your state, I think becomes really important. As you heard, I worked in Illinois for 2 different state agencies. Frequently, state agencies don't always know what other state agencies are doing. And I don't mean that pejoratively, it's just we all get siloed and we all have our day-to-day things that we need to take care of. And we may not know for sure what another state agency is working on. In fact, I still work with a lot of states today in my work at GPI, and just yesterday, this isn't a carbon capture example, but just yesterday, where I was talking to a state and the officials there were asking me, I haven't worked for the state for a number of years, but they were asking me what programs are available in their own agencies. So the idea that everybody always has a great understanding of what's going on in other parts of their state isn't always the case. So having a framework set up, a regime set up where folks know what their responsibilities are and where else they can turn for information becomes really important. Next slide, please. And again, we talked a little bit about the regulatory regime, and just to mention a couple of things on a couple of the bullet points here. Streamlining siting processes to reduce delay in permitting. I realize this is easier said than done, and this may also include trying to bring educational components into this. Now, we all realize, and those of us, if you've gone through the last set of webinars, you all realize that there are differences in pipelines for CO2 than there are for other substances that get moved via pipeline. But that doesn't always translate in terms of what the public sees or what legislators know, for example. And so the idea of trying to do some education on what it means to have CO2 pipelines dedicated to carrying CO2 could be really, really important in your particular state. And requiring regulated utilities to consider carbon technology in their integrated resource plans. That could also be in terms of clean energy standards, if you have them in your state, or other places where you're looking to try to reward the attributes of cleaner energy. Obviously, trying to make sure that carbon capture is covered in that becomes very important as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. So offering financial assistance for carbon capture projects and CO2 pipelines. We talk about this at the federal level, and I know you've covered that in earlier webinars, but pipelines are really important to this process. And we talked about it from an educational standpoint, but from an economic standpoint, they're also very important. And one of the things that the state working group has looked at, the Carbon Capture Coalition has also looked at this, is making sure that we size pipelines, maybe oversized pipelines, so that they're available for future sites. So for example, if you go back to some of those maps that we looked at earlier, and you say, well, we want to make sure that we have enough to carry CO2 from this site, but if you're also running it by some of the other sites that may be eligible or maybe make sense for retrofit, but haven't done it yet, it might make sense to oversize that pipe. And you can't really expect the person, the entity that's putting the CO2 into the pipe at first to necessarily pay for that. So that may be a function where a state government could think about that, or as has been asked for, in terms of some of the federal infrastructure bills, try to get the federal government to help pay for that oversizing. It can get paid back, it can get made up later by other people joining into the pipeline, but that's one thing that may be really helpful in terms of enticing future development in a particular state. Including carbon capture as an eligible technology for cost recovery mechanisms, really important in states that are vertically integrated. A little tougher in a state like Illinois, where generation is merchant generation, but if your state has a vertically integrated and you're looking to try to do some kind of clean energy portfolio, making sure that carbon capture can get covered is really part of that as well. The state assumption of long-term liability for stored CO2. We did this in Illinois for the Future Gen project. Department of Energy was asking us to do that at the time, and we did as a state. It's on here. It may be important. It may not be as important as it sounds. I mean, it sounds like it's really a daunting thing, but in terms of the long-term liability and the risk that's involved in it, it may not be as large as that. So while it's something to consider, I don't want people to freak out and say, well, this is obviously this is a deal breaker because my state's never going to do that. Yeah, you know, it may not even be that important to the developers, and if it is, it may not even be that much of a risk for states to take. But obviously, you'll have lots of people that will weigh in on that issue for you. Advocating for federal authorization and state use of private activity bonds, really important. So every state gets an allotment of private activity bonds that they can use. Currently, that's not, they're not eligible to be used for carbon capture projects. So there's lobbying that's going on at the federal level to try to make that a use. And then if that is done, if that is given from the federal government, allowing that in your state would be really helpful because it's low interest for private projects. If you think of it maybe as more government interest rates, but for private projects, the private activity bonds will allow to do that, and that can be really helpful as well. And again, procurement programs for things like ethanol, steel, cement, other things that are using carbon capture could be really important to that as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of tax incentives and optimization, I mean, the whole idea about this is that getting projects to profitability, there's a number that's going to take. And every project is different and every state is different. But the idea is trying to figure out, mixing and matching which of these things I've already talked about and which of the things on this slide and other considerations, what will help push that project over the finish line? What will help make that a profitable project? And so, you know, looking at all of these different things could be important. State matching 45Q tax credits, for example, for storage and saline storage. Obviously, you've got corporate income tax. Some states do, other states don't, but some states will have that. If you designate equipment as a pollution control device, that generally in a lot of states, or it could be, if you wanted to add that into your language in your state, would exempt the carbon capture equipment from property and state sales tax, which could be a huge amount in a particular project. The severance tax reductions on oil, not every state even has a severance tax. Illinois doesn't, for example. So, but I know Wyoming, for example, does. Oklahoma, there are a number of states that do. And looking at whether or not reducing that severance tax reductions on oil produced through CO2 might again be enough to push a particular capture project that's selling into enhanced oil recovery, may provide enough dollars that will make that project profitable. And again, some of these things may matter more than others depending on the project. I would recommend designing, if you're going to do things like this, designing these particular items so that there's greater flexibility. For example, what if the owner of the project doesn't own the equipment? How does the sales tax, if you're going to give an exemption, how does that play out? So making those things fungible, can they monetize the tax credit? Things like that become very important. Next slide, please. Just got two more quick things to talk about. One is through the Great Plains Institute, through our website, there's a helpful tool. It's been produced for a number of states, the best practices for states to become carbon capture ready. All the things I've talked about and more are on that particular website. We have also done some detailed information on state policies, both what's already implemented and also fact sheets for the states that are involved in the regional deployment initiatives to show some of the things that we showed earlier in the slide deck in terms of where some of the potential projects for capturing CO2 are, what the pipeline routes might be, what are some state laws that are important to the projects. So I would recommend going onto the GPI website, betterenergy.org, finding the link to the carbon capture ready section and taking a look at that. The one-page primers on carbon capture, 45Q, federal policy landscape, as we talked about, it's a really complicated area, and there are so many different factors that can weigh in. So learning as much as we can about it, we think is pretty important, and hopefully we've got a portal here that'll allow you to do that. Next slide. The other thing that we're working on now is working with a number of states on multi-state CO2 transport infrastructure, working on a memorandum of understanding between states. You can see there's a number of states who have signed on to that and others that are looking at that as well. The idea is to realizing that maybe having an intrastate pipeline might work for a particular project or a couple, but more than likely we're going to need to have interstate cooperation to have pipelines get sited, to pick up different projects that might be eligible or might make sense for that. And so the idea here is both from a states working together on particular pipelines, but also working together in talking to Congress and others about the need for this and how important it can be economically for jobs and for other state interests. So last slide is just to say thank you. I'm looking forward to questions, and also, we've got an entire team at GPI that works on these issues. So we would be happy to put you in touch with folks on the team at GPI. My contact information is here, and I know the slide deck will be available to you. And if your state is interested and not currently being part of the state working group, the regional deployment initiative, or even a work group that we've got working just on industrial innovation and capture from some of the harder to capture segments such as steel and cement and some chemical processes, feel free to contact us. We'd love to get more states involved. And with that, let me turn it back to Chair Fornstrom. Chair.
Thank you, Doug. That was excellent and really sets us up for the conclusion of this presentation today. I think if we can skip the first two slides and get to the orange slide. Doug talked about a few things that are incorporated in a very specific effort in Wyoming. Oh, sorry, I just lost my screen. A legislation that was passed this year by the Wyoming legislature and became effective on July 1st of this year. And we refer to it as House Bill 200, but the title of the bill is Reliable and Dispatchable Low Carbon Energy Standards. And there are a couple of goals with this legislation that are specifically tailored to Wyoming. One, Wyoming has a large coal fleet, I think about 19 different units in the state that are producing coal-fired electricity. We export 2/3 of that to sister states, mostly to the west. And so the goal here is to help our neighbors achieve their clean energy goals by providing them with reliable service, electricity, so so they can avoid some of the reliability issues associated with intermittent resources and help meet their low carbon standards at the same time. The second goal, though, is to help other states that receive coal from Wyoming. Wyoming is the largest coal producer in the country, producing 40% of the coal that's used in the country. Right now, Wyoming ships coal to about 29 different states, so we're also using coal-fired electricity. And so in order to preserve that industry, which is an important part of Wyoming's economy, we hope this legislation, the legislature hoped these concepts would be a model for other states to help them meet their clean energy goals, avoid the reliability issues associated with renewable energy, and support the coal industry going forward. Next slide, please. I'm going to walk through the statute. There are two sections of it. One is as a definition section, and then 3718-102 really walks through the meat of the statute, energy generation portfolio standards, rate recovery and limitations, and then some reporting requirements. Next slide. The statute in the first section defines 4 terms: carbon capture, utilization, and storage technology, dispatchable, low carbon, and there is a specific definition there in terms of tons per megawatt, and reliable. But the statute also uses some other terms that the Commission believes we may need additional help with in terms of providing definitions in the rules that we will promulgate to implement this statute, such as power quality. The legislature was interested in addressing power quality issue of voltage, different things that are occurring on the grid given the integration of increasing amounts of renewable energy on the grid. Also intermittent availability. And the statute really relies on this concept in regulation that we call incremental costs. But I think all regulators know that that term can be defined differently. And so we think it's important for all of the stakeholders to get on the same page on definitions first, so that we can all understand what we're talking about as we talk about implementing the statute. Next slide. Getting into the meat of the statute, this statute takes a very different approach to clean energy goals than most others that I have seen, where a state legislature will mandate a specific amount of clean energy by a specific date. This statute was set up to allow the commission to set utility by utility what is realistic to retrofit their coal units with carbon capture to meet these low carbon standards. And so it requires the commission to establish energy portfolio standards that maximize the use of dispatchable and reliable low carbon electricity. The commission will institute, we will have applications from all of our electric utilities with some evidence about what their coal fleet looks like, what the prospects are for retrofitting those coal units, and they will then be required to generate a certain percentage of their electricity with carbon capture technology on it. The date to achieve that cannot be later than July 1st, 2030. It allows us to set intermediate goals to make sure our utilities are on track to meet those goals by 2030. And as Doug mentioned, I think one of the most important things in this statute is it requires as a matter of state law after July 1st, 2020, that utilities include discussion of carbon capture technology in their IRP. Without discussion in the IRP, it's impossible for it to be part of the preferred portfolio. If it's not in the preferred portfolio, it's not going to be part of the action plan. So this is critically important, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in another slide. And then you'll see on the right side of this slide, again, it is for each public utility. So it's really an interesting approach to look at this from a realistic perspective about what's feasible for each utility. For example, one utility may have a much newer fleet of coal units, where another one may have units that are nearing the end of their depreciable lives. And so we want to look at a varying number of factors to determine what's realistic for retrofit of these specific units. It also requires the utility to monitor and report reliability and power quality outcomes. And again, back to the definitions of that, we're going to be digging into what that really means. What should we be expecting in terms of metrics to meet this requirement of the statute? And then the other catch-all is that the commission can require the utility to take any steps we deem necessary to maintain reliability and power quality outcomes that the stakeholder group has determined were important. Next slide, please. A significant portion of the statute is related to expanding the innovative rate-making authority of the commission. And so it puts in 3 different types of things that we can do in terms of regulatory innovation to incentivize utilities to participate in carbon capture project. One, it allows the commission to grant authority. Well, first of all, it gives us specific authority to allow carbon capture projects to go into rate base, a specific policy nod that that's acceptable for ratepayers and that they think that's a risk worth taking. It also allows the commission to authorize a higher ROE on any investment that goes into rate base for carbon capture projects. A very important concept within the bill talks about integral or adjacent to. As I mentioned in my first slide deck, one of the limitations is whether a utility can get commission approval to put this large price tag into rate base all at once. The concept of adjacent to contemplates a third party partnering with the utility to construct the carbon capture project. And that could be in a variety of ways. That third party could make the entire investment of cost to get the carbon capture project in place. There could be a cost sharing between the utility and the third party. The utility would have the ability to participate in the ROE or in the EOR project, for example. So it really opens up the door, I think, to the utility to be innovative in the financial aspects that they enter into with a third party who's probably very interested in that for an EOR project. And I want to point out that if it is adjacent to, and there are no ratepayer dollars involved in the investment into the project itself, these projects can actually result in reduced rates for ratepayers, because there would be CO2 revenue from the sale of the CO2 would be revenues that would put downward pressure on rates instead of the common issue that we talk about here, that these are just too expensive for ratepayers. It actually could reduce rates. In that same vein, it specifically allows us to grant a sharing band with shareholders for CO2. I think most people, when you talk to them, believe that CO2 belongs to ratepayers, but this statute specifically says if you want to financially incentivize the shareholders, you can give them a portion of those sales revenue to increase their revenues and their profits, and that those sale revenues, that sharing band, would be outside of the calculation of the ROE. So they would not have to count that as part of the ROE. They could take that as a separate revenue stream. And then it does allow for a rate recovery mechanism for the incremental costs associated with the carbon capture project. And this would be for the portion that the utility would invest in. It allows the commission to establish a 2% surcharge on all customer bills. That surcharge can be established in advance and collected prior to. So it could be collected for a number of years prior to the actual commencement of construction of the project. And that 2% really was a product of negotiation through the legislative process to put ratepayer protections into the statute. So looking at incremental cost protects ratepayers, the 2% number protects ratepayers, but there's also provisions in there to protect the utility. The statute does say that if that 2% is insufficient to cover the costs of the utility's portion of the investment, but that the commission applies its traditional prudency review and finds that that's prudent, it does specifically allow for recovery of prudently incurred incremental costs above that 2% surcharge that had been collected from ratepayers over those period of years. I'm sorry, if we could just stay on that last slide for 1 minute. The other point I wanted to make about the adjacent to component of this, back to the IRP requirements. It won't be sufficient for utilities to simply say, we've looked at carbon capture, it's too expensive, ratepayers can't afford it, we're not going to do it. This will require them to analyze a number of different financial scenarios and what the ratepayer impacts of those are, without simply being able to assume it all would go into rate base and dismiss it out of hand because it's too expensive. So I just want to make sure I emphasize how important that concept is, that this is not the utility going it alone and having ratepayers being 100% responsible for the cost. Next slide, please. There are some other provisions of the statute that I just wanted to touch on briefly. It contains what I call the Senate File 159 hammer. Senate File 159 is a bill that was passed in the 2019 session that requires utilities to make a good faith effort to sell any coal unit that they intend to retire. Not just retire early, but retire at all. And the commission is finishing up a formal rulemaking process on that right now of how that process will work. But the hammer in 159 has been carried forward into House Bill 200, in that if the utility does not comply with House Bill 200 and does not meet those standards set by the commission, they will not be allowed to recover the costs of any replacement generation from that coal unit. So it's a pretty good hammer for a commission to have in terms of cost recovery prohibitions, and is meant to really encourage the utilities to follow those processes and make good faith efforts to incorporate carbon capture on some of their coal units. It also gives us specific authority to promulgate rules and to see that they're satisfactorily proceeding to their standard and achieving those reliability concepts that we talked about. And we have a reporting requirement to the legislature. They want to know whether our implementation will be meeting the legislative declaration and whether this low carbon reliable electricity standard should be continued, modified, or repealed. Next slide, please. So next steps as it relates to House Bill 200, we have initiated an inclusive stakeholder process. We will be meeting for the first time on November 12th. There's a call for comments out now where we posed questions to interested parties to help us with the definition sections of the rule. Again, we feel like it's important for us to all get on the same page and have a consistent language that we're going to use as we go forward to try to draft rules related to the implementation of the rest of the statute. We like to do what we call informal rulemaking here, a stakeholder process before we get to the actual rulemaking process. We have found that to be a successful model in the past so that we can have more informal discussions between interested parties and really try to get everything ironed out before we get into the formal rulemaking process, which then you have specific times for written comments and a verbal hearing in front of the commission. And so we have found that process really streamlines the formal component. So eventually we'll get into rulemaking. We don't really have any set dates for that now, but we intend to move forward as quickly as we can to try to get these rules in place. And then significantly, the first IRP that I'm aware of that is required to include consideration of carbon capture will be Rocky Mountain Power's 2021 IRP, which is due in April. And they obviously have a large coal fleet in Wyoming and in other states across their six-state footprint. So we're interested to see how this IRP analysis looks and some of the prospects for ratepayers going forward. Next slide. So that completes the second part of my presentation. Before I turn it over to Kira and Jasmine for questions, I did want to offer a few thank yous to everyone who's made this webinar series possible and so successful. I have to start with Kip Coddington from the University of Wyoming School of Energy Resources. He was instrumental to assisting me in putting together the agenda, reaching out to potential speakers, and he's just been a great deal of assistance to me, and the program has benefited from his involvement. I also want to thank Holly Taylor and Maury Galbraith from WEEB for their support of this and all the things that they've done to make this successful. Obviously, thank you to all the other speakers who have participated. All of you performed outstandingly, and it was just I'm grateful for your generosity in sharing your time and expertise with all of us on these issues. And then, of course, last but not least, I want to thank Nayruk, Kira, and Jasmine have been fantastic. They've handled so much of the logistics, keeping us all organized, and have just done a great job in all of this. And so I'll turn it over to Kira now with my sincere thank you to everyone who's made this program possible. And Kira is going to lead us through the question and answer period. Thank you all.
Thank you, Chairman Fornstrom, and thank you, Doug, as well for your remarks. So we have gotten some questions in. I'll encourage our audience to submit more questions. You can type those into the box and send them over to me, or you can raise your hand and I will unmute you to ask your question directly. So the first question we have here is the most recent International Energy Agency report stressed the importance of CCUS to accomplish decarbonization targets. So the question is, in addition to state level efforts, like the one Chairman Fornstrom just talked about, do we need a concerted national carbon incentive or policy towards carbon capture to deploy CCUS fast enough to prevent harm from climate change? And I'm going to expand on this question a little bit just by asking also about the impact of the election on prospects for carbon capture, since we're getting so close. Carbon capture did, I think, make it into one of the town hall discussions last night. So Doug, if you could also maybe talk about the attitudes of President Trump and Joe Biden towards carbon capture and what the future might look like under either administration after the election.
That's a whole new webinar, right? We've got a couple hours for this one. So first on the IEA report. So they've been pretty clear, very consistent, very clear, exactly to the point of the question, that it's really hard to foresee for people that are interested in hitting the clean energy targets or hitting the temperature targets that are the purpose of those studies. To do it without carbon capture is really difficult and a lot more expensive too. So they make both of those points. So to the question, yes, I mean the federal efforts have become extremely important and always have been. Mentioned, working through the Carbon Capture Coalition, which is designed to do just that, which is try to influence federal policy. Successful a couple of years ago in February of 2018 with the 45Q tax credits that were mentioned by the chair and by me during the presentation. Extremely important. Working on things like the Master Limited Partnership, extending the 45Q, looking at infrastructure, pipelines, those kinds of things becomes really important. And the other part that we shouldn't forget on the whole national look at this, and I mentioned it a little bit in my remarks, and I was focusing more on state, but the whole idea that this isn't just about power plants. It's not just about coal. It's about gas in terms of power plants, but it's part of ethanol. It's part of a look at how we do chemical processing. It's part of steel. It's part of cement. All these places where carbon emissions come from are all things that need to be worked on. They all require very different types of responses. There's no one size fits all for the industrial side. And so working on a federal plan that recognizes all of that and provides inducements and enhancements for trying to get these projects going that states can then work with and supplement becomes really, really important. It did make it into one of the town halls last night. You know, obviously there's been a lot of money through DOE for carbon capture projects going back across administrations, both red and blue administrations going back a number of years. I would expect that to continue. And part of the reason I expect that to continue is that when you start to see utilities talk about, well, we have 2050 clean energy goals, we're pretty sure we can get to that interim goal in 2030. We're not sure how to get to that last 20% between 2030 and 2050. And they always mention carbon capture as one of the technologies that they're looking at. They'll mention advanced nuclear, they talk about storage, but carbon capture frequently ends up in that discussion. And so I would expect that to continue on the national level, but it requires some diligence for folks to work through those issues. I'm sorry, Kara, I gave a long answer there. I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
I think your answer is perfect. I don't have anything to add. I'm pretty focused on state policy. Generally aware of federal policy, but I think that's much more your game than mine.
Thanks.
Chairman Fornstrom, a question for you. What was the reaction like among regulated utilities and other stakeholders as well to HB 200?
Well, I'm not sure we fully know that yet. What I can tell you is what testimony the legislature received in the various committees where this bill went through. And I would say one of the criticisms that was levied against the bill related to ratepayer expense. And I think there was a general misunderstanding about the adjacent to concept that I mentioned and how the commission's traditional prudency review is not replaced, that this is completely consistent with how the commission would look at these things, but that this really opened up alternatives. And so the criticism that I heard mostly was related to negative impacts to ratepayers, which, as I mentioned, I think the statute allows the commission to address on a case-by-case prudency review. I think probably the first real reaction we'll get from this is, as I said, the analysis that we'll see in Rocky Mountain Power's 2021 IRP, how much they look at various options of financing and what those impacts look like and what those results look like in the modeling for ratepayers. So I would say it had significant support in the legislature. This bill was not a committee bill. It was introduced at the very beginning of the session. It was one of our, what we call a short session in Wyoming. It was only 20 days. And this bill was able to get through both houses and get signed by the governor. So it has significant support from a policy perspective from the legislature. And obviously ratepayer concerns were raised, but we'll see how it gets implemented. And a lot of the details were left to the commission to work through. And so we'll get a better sense of people's reactions as we work through the stakeholder process and start drafting our rules to implement the law.
This may also be a question that's a little premature, but can you talk about the additional reporting requirements and any information that the PSC either has requested or will requested from utilities to ensure that the intent of HB 200 is being implemented and executed?
Yeah, I think that is premature. I really can't tell you how beneficial is that stakeholder process is to the commission. We don't approach these things with a clear script of how we think any of this is going to go. We really want to hear from the people that are affected by it, from the utilities, from other parties, customer groups, etc. And so we'll have to wait and see what we think is important about that and what metrics might be put into place that the commission can monitor.
Mm-hmm. Doug, more of a question for you. Can you talk a little bit about what we're seeing in other states? Of course, this webinar series has largely drawn on speakers from Wyoming, I think to a large extent because Wyoming is such a leader in carbon capture. But have other states kind of been considering some similar policy options to HB 200, or is Wyoming really kind of sort of alone getting past the starting line?
Well, I think Wyoming is clearly a leader in this, and that's true of the chair and the commission, also true of governors of some both Governor Gordon and before him Governor Meade, as I mentioned earlier. So I think Wyoming is a leader. They, clearly through the university system and a lot of the other moves that Kara talked about, a lot of the infrastructure that they've built up. They're a great state to look at in terms of what are some of the possibilities, what are some of these things you can do. But I think a lot of other states are doing that as well, whether that's looking at things like trying to take over primacy for siting of Class 6 wells. I know you talked about that during one of the earlier presentations, but that's something where the US EPA is allowing states to do that now, and there are states that are moving forward to obtain that primacy. You're seeing Louisiana do a lot right now with respect to some of their industrial. They've also got a clean energy goal now, but they're also moving forward in terms of some of their industrial uses and how they can incorporate capture into that. And a lot of the states, of those, almost half the states in the country that are looking at these issues, that are part of the state working group, all to one degree or another have started looking at these particular policies. I mentioned what we had done in Illinois back, a decade ago, talking about the Future Gen project, and we're certainly not alone there. There are test projects, there are projects that are going on really all over the country. So no, it's not unique to Wyoming, but Wyoming is certainly a leader and one of the leaders in the country in terms of how they've approached these issues.
One other way that our webinar series has focused is really on the investor-owned utility community, just since we've been working with Chairman Fornstrom and other NARUC members in trying to come up with points that are relevant to public service commissions. So we haven't talked much about how municipal and cooperative utilities have been approaching CCUS. Has there been much interest among those utilities that aren't necessarily commission regulated?
Yeah, we've had some interest. We've talked to a lot of the either municipals or the co-ops in terms of this. A little bit more difficult in some cases, not in every case, but a little bit more difficult in some cases, just in terms of where what the economics are of a particular project. And again, a lot of what we talked about during my presentation was that all these projects are different, and so the considerations that we would think about on a state level, a muni or a co-op is thinking about on their level as well. But I know there are a lot of plants that aren't owned by a muni or a co-op, for example, but serve them, where they're thinking about CCUS, and there have been some very kind of progressive on this issue co-ops that have really looked at this issue extensively, and I expect we're going to see more of that as time goes on, as they start picking up these clean energy goals a little bit more. You're starting to see that a lot more in the muni and co-op community than maybe you did a decade ago. And as they start to look at that, I think you're going to start to see a lot more with respect to carbon capture from them as well.
So I would just point out in Wyoming, Dry Forks plant, which is owned by Basin Electric Co-op, that's actually the site of the integrated test center, where 20 megawatts of flue gas is diverted into this research center for different capture technologies to be studied and utilization efforts. It's just outside of Gillette, Wyoming, which is the coal capital of the world, we think. And also that's very close to the location of the carbon safe DOE project that's focused on sequestration. So in Wyoming, we've seen a huge push. Tri-State's an investor in the ITC. So both the co-ops that supply electricity as G&Ts to Wyoming local co-ops we've seen great interest and willingness to put money down and work on these technologies. They've been critical to Wyoming's success in pursuing these things.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, I think we have about 1 minute left, so we did have some final slides to run through. Jasmine, if we could advance to our current events. So of course, this is the 6th and final webinar in our series, so we hope you've enjoyed this. We have a few innovation webinars coming up beginning next week through NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation. And of course, we also have our annual meeting next month. Registration is open for that. And next slide. WEEB is also beginning their Fall 2020 Joint CREPC YREB webinar series that starts next Friday, October 23rd. You can visit westernenergyboard.org to learn more and register for that event. And yeah, I'll just echo Chairman Fornstrom's thank you to all of our excellent speakers, to Kip for all of his help organizing, to Holly and Maury at the Western Interstate Energy Board, and to the U.S. Department of Energy Fossil Energy Office for helping to make this webinar series possible. So I'll pass it back to Chairman Fornstrom to close us out today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kira. Well, I think we've covered it. Doug, I don't know if you had any closing thoughts you wanted to provide.
Good, thanks.
I think we accomplished our purpose today to close this webinar series with some practical solutions for states to get, as we say, carbon capture ready. I know Doug and I are both available offline if anyone has any other questions that we didn't get to today. Thank you for your time. I hope everyone has a great weekend. Thank you so much.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.